Good afternoon and welcome to this session sponsored by the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, looking at green finance and the impact of environmental, social and governance on the financial sector. I'm Ben Ormsby and I am the Yorkshire editor of the Business Desk, and it's my privilege to be able to chair this event today. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. So if you would like to ask any questions throughout, please do so using the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will endeavour to do my best multitasking skills to read those while keeping my, expert panel both on time and on topic for the next 45 minutes. There's clearly been a massive acceleration of both green finance and a focus on ESG over the last recent years. So we're going to start the discussion with ESG and the role it takes in investors and funders' sort of decision making. So I'll quickly introduce my panel. So we have Julian Wells, Director of Whitecap Consulting and Fintech Nauth. George Graham, Director of South Yorkshire Pensions Authority. Natasha Nauth, the Relationships Director at NatWest. Iain Clacher, Professor of Pensions and Finance and the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment at Leeds University Business School. Peggie, the Director of Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund. And Dr. Arthur Krebbers, the Head of Sustainable Finance Corporates at NatWest. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start the session with a bit of a round-robin question, which we will do in the order you're on my screen, so I apologise if that's not the same order that you were on your own screen. But as we said at the start, the focus of the emphasis that ESG is getting seems to be growing. Within your experience, how are you seeing, within your own organisation or organisations you work with, how are you seeing that emphasis change? Starting with you, Julian.
Hey, thanks, Ben. I guess to sort of jump straight into your question, it's become one of the most prominent issues. I think every year there are always things in the work that we do as a consultancy at Whitecap that our clients are particularly interested in, and I think right now ESG is a really hot topic. Particularly with the financial sector clients. So yeah, it's its moment really. It's not a new thing. It's not a new topic to talk about. But I think this is the fourth event in the last few weeks that I've been involved in that's had a focus on this very topic. So yeah, it's hot right now for sure.
Glad you said it's hot and that we're not original is the important answer there, Julian. On to you, Natasha.
Yeah, so I guess it's purposeful for us as an organisation. NatWest, it's at the forefront of all of our minds on day-to-day on what we do, how we act. If I can talk about specific businesses, our Coots business in terms of investment decisions, we've dedicated that this year we'll reduce equity holdings by 25% in terms of emissions and 50% on all holdings by the end of 2030. So from our perspective, it's embedded in our day-to-day. It's part of our purpose. Us as a bank feel there's a strong link between performance and those that have good corporate practices. It's kind of been viewed recently by some of the news stories that you've seen where companies that perhaps have great bottom line numbers perhaps don't necessarily have the ESG credentials that you might want, and you've seen an impact on share price. So I think that, as Julian said, it's a hot topic now, but not because it's the new thing it's because it needs to be the hot topic and it needs to be on the forefront of every business's and corporate's mind, because for the next 10 years that's what we're going to see.
Grant, to you.
Thanks, Ben. I guess there's sort of two ways of looking at it. There's looking at it from us as an institution and what is our impact on ESG, what do we need to do to address that? And clearly we're sort of developing a new refreshed ESG strategy. But I guess the other side of the equation is what do we do as an investor? So we don't invest in companies, we invest in funds. And historically, what we've tended to do is to take a siloed approach. Oh, we'll invest in this clean tech fund, or we'll make an allocation to clean tech. And I think the real challenge for us going forward is how do we take it out of the silo and how do we mainstream it as a part of our investment decision making? So that's the challenge for us, which we're starting to think about. We don't have all the answers yet, but clearly it is a changing world, and we will be, looking at the impact we have in terms of particularly thinking about the environment as well as a part of our investment decision making process.
Iain?
So coming at it from a sort of pensions and asset management angle rather than the centre, if you look at the amount of money that is held just in pensions in the UK, it's about 3.5 trillion, and that money is there for people's retirements. And if that money is invested as it is currently, it's targeting a 3.8 degree rise in global temperatures. Means essentially the planet's not livable. So there's got to be an en masse reallocation of capital out of these investments that are going to contribute to climate change into things that are moving towards net zero, but also to things that are going to start to remove carbon. And I think when you look at it now, the global realisation of what has to be done, I think, is really, really stark now. And so it permeates all aspects of sort of institutional finance.
Mm-hmm. And going to you next, George.
Yeah, so we invest the pension savings of 167,000 people. So they have an interest in, as Iain was saying, the planet still being here when they come to take their pension out of the pension fund. So it's a big focus for us. It's been a big focus actually since the late 80s, when the then chair of the Pensions Authority convened a meeting of local authority pension funds to talk about ESG issues, as they're now called, and how you considered them in investment. And it's still a big issue for us. We've got a very aggressive target to achieve net zero in our investment portfolios, and we're looking to do that on behalf of our scheme members, who are very interested in seeing that happen. But we need to ensure that those who invest money on our behalf, because like Grant was saying, we invest through funds and fund managers, we need to ensure those fund managers have good ESG practice embedded into their investment process, so that they're not investing in a company that's got dreadful labour practices and paying less than the minimum wage and doesn't know about it. The supply chain should not be an excuse for companies behaving badly, as it's been too often. I think one of the things for us is that climate is important, and we recognise it as the biggest risk to the value of our investment portfolio. But all those other S&G risks are, in a sense, equally important. And the last 12 months has taught us anything. I think it's taught us that the S is perhaps as important as the E in some senses.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Arthur, to you.
Sure. So where I sit within the NatWest Sustainable Finance team, I interface both with the treasury side of companies and indeed also with a range of ESG investors. And I think for both those stakeholders, the ESG has become very much front and center of how they view their job profile going forward. And I think on the treasurer side, that's interesting, because traditionally a corporate treasurer would have quite a narrow, if you want, conservative view of their role. I manage the company's money. I'm not a climate activist or anything. But they've gotten to realize that actually ESG is now quite core to being successful in that endeavor, because more and more of their investors, their banks, their financial counterparties are expecting them to adhere to minimum sustainability standards. When we did a recent survey, it suggested that 53% of UK companies consider ESG factors as core to their credit or equity story. And it's similar on the investor side, where ESG has been around for a few decades. It was quite one-dimensional, sort of an exclusion-based approach. But these days you're seeing very sophisticated sustainability strategies being deployed that look at impact, that look at momentum, that look at risk management. And again, that's both for sustainability reasons, but also for hard-nosed commercial reasons, because fund managers are finding that at least 2/3 of the new mandates they're trying to win have ESG features in the RFPs. So even if they're still very cynical about this, they realize that if they don't have a credible proposition, that they risk being left behind.
So I guess the interesting part there that comes to me is that movement. You said it's been around, ESG or ESG as a concept has been around for decades, but it's coming more to the fore. So how do you see that movement developing? What do you think the potential end proposition could be for how important it is to an investor's decision to invest in a company or into a location or any of that? Because obviously Yorkshire is always fighting for its share of investment. Let's be frank, every part of the country is, and all the businesses based here are doing that as well. So how, if it is rising in importance, how can those businesses based here start to perhaps capitalize on the opportunity that investors see through ESG? I'm going to throw it open and see if anyone wants to try and tackle that behemoth of a question.
For me, Ben, it's two things. It's one, taking proactive ownership of your sustainability story, because if you don't, other stakeholders will start to fill that in and not necessarily come to the right conclusions. And I think the other one is prioritization. There's so many ESG initiatives and metrics out there. It's a bit of an alphabet soup. So knowing which are the ones to really focus on, that 80-20 rule, the ones that really matter to investors, is key as well. So it's those two elements, be proactive and learn to prioritize.
I would add to that, Ben, that ESG is an important consideration for defining your model, how a company meets it. So there won't be the same common model across all businesses. There won't be the same approach across all businesses. So you will have to assess it for your own business and the credibility of what you need to do across environmental, social, and governance. How do they really relate to your company? How do they really relate in the short term kind of financial performance and long term what your investors want to see?
So we've actually had our first question, which stems from the fact that it's been asked as everyone seems to have their own take on what ESG means. So he's asked what each of the panelists considers their definition of ESG. So in the interest of trying to find out the commonality that we all have, who would like to provide their definition of ESG first?
I'll go first. We've got a whole page of that is on the Pensions Authority's website somewhere of what our beliefs in terms of responsible investment and ESG are. But in essence, it comes down to we all want to be a good owner of good companies, and good companies behave well towards their workforce, towards the communities they exist in, and towards the environment. And they have processes that make sure they do that on a continuous and sustainable basis. So that's, if you give me a company that's got all those characteristics, tick. That's what I'm looking to invest in.
So there's an interesting part to this for me. So I broadly agree with that definition, and it sort of comes back to what both Arthur and Natasha were saying, is the measurement problem of this.
Yeah.
Is really, really hard to do. And I think for governance, we can come up with metrics which broadly people would start to say, well, that seems to be a well-run organisation, whether that's listed or private. There are sort of norms that we have for this. I think around environment, there is a very big difference from this is what my carbon exposure is as an investor, or this is what I produce as a business, and whether that's scope 1, 2 or 3 declarations. Around something like the TCFD, so Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, versus this is what my transition looks like, and this is how I'm going to get from here to net zero and beyond, or what is my physical risk. So there's a lot of granularity to this, which is very difficult, and I don't think we've got good handles and measures on it yet. And then the other one is what we mean by social, because I think that's the hardest one to define just now, because I think G is well defined, everybody's very focused on E, but social's difficult. And I think that's where there's a real challenge. So we know what it is, but I don't think we know how to measure it.
But having said that, I was looking at a stat the other day that said 93% of the world's largest companies now report on ESG. So I guess they're all reporting in the way that they see it. I agree with you, Iain. Data is obviously really important. That's the key to all of this, and all the discussions we've had, including a really good Fintech Nauth session recently, which you were on as well. All kind of came back to a point around transparency and understanding, and the need to have data that means something to people, so that they can make decisions and judgments. Well, people and organisations, I guess that relates to.
It's a critical point, because when you ask an investor, what's the one thing a company needs to do to show they're committed to sustainability, the answer often is improve the quality of sustainability reporting. That's a critical element, and things like getting into a certain index, coming out with a green bond, that's all great, but it's about getting your house in order and indeed improving the quantification of your ESG targets.
One of my favourite things is the idea that we could get rid of the title Chief Financial Officer and replace it with Chief Sustainability Officer. So you're not just responsible for the financials, you're responsible for all these other things. And once you start to align people's compensation along these kind of lines, then you'll get much more positive action.
I think that's, for me, ESG, I guess you can Google lots of definitions. You can look on the line, and there's a definition for E, the S, the G. E is very well defined, carbon, we all understand that. Now I think the S is people, it's getting better, and COVID has brought that to the forefront. The G, the governance part, hasn't been dealt with really that well for now. There's no kind of one size fits all, and I guess that's what hopefully COP26 will bring together later on in the year and work towards kind of flashing out that G. But for me, ESG is very simply that I want this planet to be somewhere that my kids can live in 50 years' time. I want my kids to be able to have an equal, diverse kind of workforce, be able to have the same opportunities as the person sitting next to them, and kind of them to just live in a world where they're not worried about flooding and extreme climate.
That was very well said, Natasha. I think we would all nod and agree to it. I guess steering it on slightly, obviously we've mentioned that E feels really well defined, and that measuring of carbon and the environmental impact of businesses. But how do you see that changing? Because we are moving, hopefully, fingers crossed, towards a net zero economy. At varying different speeds. I think Yorkshire, many of the local authorities are aiming for 2030. As a country, it's 2050. They're quite ambitious targets in some cases. How do you see that changing? Because some of those businesses that exist now really are going to struggle with that decarbonisation. So I guess, is that going to impact how investors view them, or will they see an opportunity to decarbonise them, and therefore they still attract new forms of finance? Perhaps, Grant, I guess the work of the Northern Powers Investment Fund, it funds clean tech and green tech, as you said, but it also funds businesses that are doing traditional manufacturing and might need to upgrade.
You're right, Ben. I think there's two elements to it. There's the sort of the innovation space. How can we support those companies who with new in terms of moving towards net zero, sort of leveraging the university and the research base that we have in Yorkshire. I think the bigger challenge is working with established businesses to help them to become cleaner and decarbonise. And I think that's clearly one of the things that we've been trying to do through the Northern Powerhouse Fund, is to show that you can support these traditional companies, you can help them reduce their carbon footprint, but also that can be a part of their growth journey as well. It does mean that they quite often are creating new jobs, which is important for the local economy, and you're supporting investment in sort of gradual innovation as opposed to sort of groundbreaking innovation as well. So I think there's two elements to it. I think the innovation bit is really important, but I think there is also the other bit about helping those companies who, whether it's manufacturing or other sectors, who do need help to decarbonise, whether that's through ourselves, whether it's through grant funding from others. But I think that's an important part of the picture. You have to have both. It's not one only solution.
If you look at one of the faster growing areas of sustainable finance, it's this concept of transition finance. right? And embedding sustainability and decarbonisation targets within a financial instrument so as to incentivize a company to progress on that journey. So I think we've moved beyond the market where investors are just looking at already close to carbon neutral companies, but investors are looking at momentum and level of ambition of companies as they decarbonize.
So just 2 quick points from the chat. Emma from Mott McDonald's highlights that E is far more than carbon. It includes biodiversity, air quality, water quality, and quantity, and all the ecosystems. So yeah, we are talking about it in a carbon way in many of these conversations, but yeah, it does go beyond that. We've also got a question from Veronica who asks, in the view of the panelists, should financial institutions and funds apply ESG criteria to the SMEs in their supply chain, as well as the charities and community interest companies that they want to work with, or just to the things they look to invest in? And what are your thoughts? Let's see if anyone wants to try and...
I mean, to respond to Emma's point about E being more than carbon, yes, it is. And in terms of a question about measurement, there's some work being started by something called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is going to try and develop some metrics and some measurement in that area. In terms of the supply chain, yeah, I don't want to be dealing with a small cleaning company, for example, cleaning my office, that's paying less than the minimum wage for their staff. I will specify in the contract that I want them to pay the real living wage. You know, I don't want to be dealing with a waste collection company that's going to tip my waste all over the moors. You know, we have to act responsibly, and that applies to not just how we invest, in our case, the money of a pension fund, but how we operate as an organisation.
I agree with George's point. I think the challenge is for those smaller businesses down the supply chain. It's great, you know, sort of getting the large companies who won the contract to want to do the right thing. But what you don't want to do is to let those small businesses further down the supply chain lose out on business. So it's a kind of carrot and stick approach. You need to have the right mechanisms in place to support those smaller businesses, to help them do the right thing, and not simply say, if you don't do it, you lose the contract. So I think there's a bit of, you know, carrot and stick is probably the best way of describing it. You've got to encourage people, incentivize people to make those changes, particularly as you get down into the smaller businesses.
There are some good models here that we could pinch from somewhere I used to work across the Pennines, dare I say it. There's this thing that gets a lot of press called the Preston model, and it is actually a real thing, and it really does direct lots more, particularly spend from large institutions like mine, like local authorities, into local SMEs, encouraging them to do the right thing and keeping them in the supply chain. So I think there's stuff we can perhaps learn from elsewhere here.
And I guess just picking up again on George's point, I think there's lots of good practice elsewhere in the UK and potentially internationally. We shouldn't just say, you know, let's develop a Yorkshire solution, which is only, you know, for Yorkshire. We really do need to look at good examples around the rest of the world, around the rest of the UK, and see if we can adopt it and make it suitable for Yorkshire as well.
I think the UK overall is doing pretty well in this field. Again, another stat I came across recently that we're the main UK retail banks offer green loan programs. All of them do, and over 500 investors have signed up to the UN's Principles of Responsible Investment. So there's more investors in the UK that have signed up to that than any other country in the world. So our sort of UK view on this is quite interesting. It seems to me that it's like a movement, really, isn't it? Where there's lots of different stakeholders here. We've got consumers, we've got companies, but I think really one of the important things with companies is the employees as well. And we're getting to a point where there's a socially acceptable place to draw the line. And I think it's a very fair question that candidates are going to be asking in interviews when they go to speak to a company. Like, what are you doing? What are your ESG policies, or what's your sustainable business approach? And people's beliefs are increasingly sort of aligned to those things. But the really big movements will come from the big. I mean, a couple of you mentioned pensions already. That what happens with that, where the real significant funds are invested, and what the sort of the purposes of those funds, how they're aligned.
Yeah, I would echo that. And certainly at NatWest, it's probably the most common question that graduates are asking us now: what are you doing in terms of sustainable finance? And I guess on the topic of supply chains, I think it is very, very pertinent, because more and more multinational companies are setting Scope 3 emission reduction targets, which will inevitably mean they'll have to become much more selective and thoughtful around which suppliers they engage in. So it's important, I think, from an SME perspective, to be very, very aware of that knock-on effect that will happen.
I'm going to take one of the points that was mentioned a little while ago and use that to pivot the conversation slightly. So we've talked about ESG and its rise and its importance and the role it's taking. I guess the other side of this is the growth of green finance. You mentioned then, Julian, all the UK banks are offering green loans and things. But as a financial centre, we'll use Leeds as the example of this to start with. But what opportunities does the green finance offer Yorkshire as a whole? I guess Leeds probably first starts out because you've got the infrastructure bank that was announced in the budget coming, which is going to clearly do some green funding. You've got the Bank of England looking to relocate staff there. It feels there could be a groundswell for Leeds and then wider the region to benefit from this movement of green finance. Yeah,
you got some big stories there. That the ones you've mentioned. Iain's the Greening Finance Centre. But I always get the name wrong. Sorry, Iain. But it's those words in a different order, isn't it? The infrastructure bank. But I think there's some really interesting activity around Leeds. We have some people who know a lot about this subject. People on this call. If anyone's ever heard Georgina Mitchell from Well House speak on this topic, she's really knowledgeable. She gives a great overview. I'd imagine she's listening actually, so hopefully she is. But we've got a couple of interesting sort of earlier stage businesses as well that spring to mind. Curve Block, who are developing energy positive housing. And obviously one of the sponsors of this event, I think, as well, aren't they? But developing energy.
In fact, just to cut you off there, they are speaking on the next session, which I'm chairing.
Oh, great. Okay.
Right after this one. So thanks for the plug.
No, but they are so interesting to look at because they're building this energy positive housing, but at the same time, the way that they're funding that is they've got this sort of fractional ownership, this property, this investment opportunity that uses kind of technology and fintech to let people do that. But I was listening to a podcast last night that Joey Jones, one of the founders, was talking on, and he was talking about how they've got one of the things they've got a vision for is that because the houses they're developing are energy positive, that they could potentially work with mortgage lenders to take the the energy that can be contributed back to the grid and sold back, take the value of that and use that to basically secure deposits for people that want to buy homes. So you'd be able to buy a house by letting your mortgage lender take a first charge on the energy that you will contribute back to the grid over the next few years. And so then you're starting to enable sort of better social outcomes in the economy by applying technology and finance to things that are also good for the environment around us. So some of that, I think some of that's just fascinating. It's worth listening to Curve Block talk rather than me try and explain what they do, because they obviously do it much better than I do.
I'm just going to sort of try and counterbalance the Leeds focus, and we do have some great investments, some great companies in Leeds. Slingshot Simulations, which was a University of Leeds spin out, who've got working on a project now to reduce traffic congestion and improve air quality in both Leeds, Sheffield, and Hull. Is a great example of an innovative company. And this is a bit of a plug, so apologies, but the British Business Bank is headquartered in Sheffield. We are the largest early stage investor in the UK. We have billions under management, and of course, as a result of the COVID situation, we now have 1.5 million SMEs in our portfolio. So, there are, if you look at it, Yorkshire as a whole, I think, the story is great. As we've said, we've got the National Infrastructure Bank and Iain Centre. So if you start to look at that, it really does sort of play to our different strengths, and also recognising, the expertise and the knowledge we have in the university base, in places like sort of Siemens out at Hull as well. So from a Yorkshire perspective, I think there's a very strong story, although of course the focus has been on Leeds recently following the new announcements.
I just want to come in on my centre. It's not actually mine, it's led by the University of Oxford, and it's a consortium of universities, so it's Leeds, Imperial, Reading, Bristol and Oxford, and it's a national centre. The problem's global. Now, in terms of the regional aspect of it, there's going to be a hub in Leeds based at Nexus at the university and at the Royal Institution led by Imperial. And that's going to be for businesses to start to innovate, to be able to provide climate and environmental risk analytics and to broadly define all aspects of finance, so pensions, asset management, insurance, and banking. And the sort of purpose of it is transparency in data models. Because if everybody's using different data or black box solutions, then you're going to get bad outcomes. So actually there's a huge commercial opportunity for the UK to be leading on this. And so it's fantastic that we are part of it, that it's a national endeavour. Global problem, I think that always has to be, I think the competition aspect across regions is really, for something like this, it's not going to work. This has to be something that's collective.
Well, it's always very exciting to talk about, I guess, the startups and the R&D taking place. I think within the Yorkshire region, there's also a number of, I guess, more established companies that have done very interesting, have implemented very interesting strategies when it comes to sustainability. And in the last 2 years, we've seen the Northern Power Grid and also Yorkshire Water, Kelda, come to market with quite exciting sustainable finance frameworks, which I think will have a very positive effect on the region and the regional capital markets.
I think that bringing those institutions into Yorkshire, though, creates a different set of opportunities, because one of the things we've noticed is that making the connection between people who invest money and people who need money to be invested at a local level is not necessarily terribly easy, because the people who invest money tend to be based in those nice leafy places down south, and they don't realize that there's opportunities up here to the degree that perhaps there are. So actually, by putting people in the same place, they recognize those opportunities, and we've seen that in a property loans program that we run in South Yorkshire, that because we're focused in investment manager on South Yorkshire, they're finding transactions that are really valuable to us in investment terms, but which they wouldn't have found otherwise, because they would never have looked in South Yorkshire for those transactions. So actually putting people in the area means that they will find stuff that's really investable and beneficial that needs to happen. So bringing that infrastructure to Yorkshire is a really important move.
And yeah, picking up on Iain's point, I agree. To me, my view on these things always is collaboration first and then competition second. Let's sort it out, and then we can fight out who's 1, 2, and 3 afterwards. And as long as Yorkshire comes out on top, we'll all be happy. But except for the Lancastrian on the call, let's be brutally honest. You're right, Judge. That the view of bringing those people, it creates a groundswell of momentum that maybe gives other investors and other businesses the confidence to go, actually, there is the community there that exists in Yorkshire. And it's something I think we probably would all agree it already exists within the financial sector, but the chance to bring that and leave that green financial future and help be the people who maybe we quoted as the Yorkshire model or whatever it is. that, you know, I agree with there's lots we can learn from other places, but it feels there is an opportunity, I guess. What do you think we need to do to make ourselves that hub for green finance, or do you think it will happen naturally?
I think it will happen naturally because we're already like a financial sector, you know, the hub for a lot of things in Yorkshire. The government have already given us that Whitehall package to say, you know, we want to recognise Leeds as one of the green finance centres. I agree with Iain earlier that even though it's Leeds as, you know, green finance hub, it's a collaborative approach across the country. We need to work together. Arguably, Yorkshire and the Humber, you know, we have one of the highest carbon percentages going back to across the country, and we can make the biggest impact, I guess, which is the reason why we all need to kind of work together and be on board. And I think that there's already a lot of talent in the area. There's already a lot of up and coming great startups. There's also some well established companies that this is part of their day to day now. So I think that as a region, we have a lot to say. We have a lot to kind of shout about, and I think it's a really positive thing with the kind of collaborative approach on the project Iain was talking about between Leeds universities. It's great that it's up there with Oxford and the likes of the other universities that Leeds has mentioned there. So I think that there's a lot of private capital in this area as well, in the region, and that private capital needs to be put into these projects. And, you know, as a, you know, we're a large bank, and we need to look at supporting kind of this transition, the SMEs in the area. You know, how tangibly do you work with what's coming in Leeds? How tangibly do you transition? What products are available to you? What support is available to you? And I think that working together is a huge part of that.
So I guess then, as a sort of final question, we've got 10 minutes, so maybe final, maybe a couple more. What do you think the next evolution of this is going to be? We've sort of said ESG's evolved heavily. We've talked about the rise of green finance. What are you excited about within the financial sector that relates to this sort of sustainability and environmental agenda? I'll do it as a round robin, and if you want to name check some businesses that you think are the next big thing, you can do it. But you know, it's your choice how you answer that question. But yeah, what's next, and what have you got your eyes on the horizon for? I'll start with Iain.
So I'm just going to plug my own centre. It's not my centre, but the centre.
From this moment on, it is now your centre.
Yeah, I know, I'm part of it. But I think one of the things that we're doing is spatial finance. So one of our partners is the Satellite Applications Catapult, and we're using geospatial data and high resolution imaging to start to do an awful lot of this at scale. And one of the things we want to be able to do is any point on Earth, past, present and future, for climate scenario modelling. So I think that's really cool when you're starting to see real advances in science and technology come to then sort of mainstream into finance. I think there's some incredible innovation that could happen there, and I think that's rather exciting.
That does sound pretty well, yeah.
Yeah.
I can't even quite get my head around that. So, but yeah, Arthur.
I guess for my side, when it comes to the next few years, I'm excited also about innovation, clearly within the capital markets. You know, until recently, the only sustainable finance option you really had was a bond or a loan. But in the last year or two, we started to see that really expand into every possible financial instrument, all the way from sort of early stage venture capital, sustainability focus, through to everyday, you know, bank accounts, supply chain finance, etc. And I guess my hope is we will get to a world where, you know, if you're managing companies' finances, you won't have to compromise your sustainability goals for your, you know, treasury priorities. You have sustainability options throughout the sort of financial instrument universe. And I guess then looking at it from a longer term perspective, then my hope is, you know, this becomes business as usual. When I'm an investor and I look at an asset, I look at a company, yes, I'll look at the credit metrics, at the industry, but I'll also look at the carbon intensity of the company and its social policies.
And Grant, same question to you.
Just picking up on Arthur's point, what I'm really looking forward to and excited about is taking it away from sort of being a niche or unique sort of part of access to finance and seeing it mainstreamed, so that when you're looking to invest, that it's an automatic part of decision making, and it includes the social bit. We know that's challenging, but I think that's important to include. So that's one bit. At the risk of making myself slightly unpopular, is the collaboration across the north. So some of the challenges we're facing in Yorkshire and the Humber are also the challenges that they're facing in the Tees Valley or in the northeast, and also, dare I say, on the other side of the Pennines. So I'm quite excited by the collaboration that we're seeing on developing a northern approach to tackling some of these issues.
Natasha?
I think much of the same. I'm looking forward to the innovation. I'm looking forward to seeing what's next in terms of the next evolution, starting from the bottom up to the top. So like our EPC mortgages that we're looking at, hopefully they will become part of business as usual. We're doing exciting collaborations with companies to kind of roll out EV charging to the homeowners. So I think that, right from the top, in the debt capital markets, right down to the bottom, you and I as the retail customer, we have 19 million customers, and I look forward to ways we can serve them all across the board.
George?
I suppose I'd agree with much of what's been said, but I suppose for us as an institution, the next big thing in this space is how we make a connection between the impact that our investment has on the world, however you define that impact, whether it's ES or G, and the people who save for their pension with us. So how do we help those people understand the impact their savings have, and then how, while still meeting all our investment objectives, because that's got to be our priority, do we ensure that that impact is a positive one rather than a negative one? And part of that is going to have to come from markets beginning to actually properly value the negatives in things like oil companies. It's very easy to make an investment case to still invest in an oil company because of the way the valuations are calculated. And the market will need to make that next year. When that happens, that's the tipping point where we'll see green finance in some ways take off.
Fantastic. And lastly, Julian, if you can keep it succinct, we're running out of time.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, some great points. I think I agree with lots of things people have said. I think for me, one of the interesting things is innovation related to product, and how we see some of the sort of sustainable finance, ESG thinking start to embed itself in product design, and the way that we, if you think, we need to get to a point where it's socially unacceptable to not go down the right route and not make the right decision. At some point in the years to come, it'll be the wrong thing to do to not have an electric car. Like, to buy a car that's not an electric car will be just, even though you still can, it just won't be socially acceptable. And we need to get to a point where people are choosing financial products and investments, and there's a degree of transparency, that they understand what they're doing and that they're making decisions that are the right decisions. The other point, I think, is the great one that a couple of you touched on around the bigger geography, so the wider north, but also the wider UK. We're doing some work in Scotland at the moment, and this is a real hot topic there as well. And it's a whole UK wide debate, and I think we need to not think too geographically, although it is always nice to see where you live prospering, of course. Is that succinct enough for you, Ben?
That was perfect. That was perfect, because we've just enough time to do a quick wrap up and say, firstly, Thank you to all our panelists. It's been a really interesting discussion. And I think if we're going to take something away, it is that collaboration is key, but that the movement is going in the right direction with ESG and with green finance, and that there are clearly going to be opportunities to come for Yorkshire from that. Thank you to our sponsor, the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund. If you've not visited the expo or taken part in the networking, please do. And if you'd like to find out more about Curb Block or how the property sector as a whole is looking at sustainability, please join me for my next session, Building Back Better, which will start at 2:35. So thank you very much to everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the session.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.